This is wildlife biologist Eric Orff with New Hampshire Fish and Wildlife. Let me tell you the story about these big buck antlers I have here. This was a 200-pound plus buck that I happened to ride down a steep hill one November in 1983. Let me go to my diaries. We'll talk about that night a little bit and a little bit more about these antlers. Well, my diary said it was November 17th, 1983. I was selected by my supervisor, Henry Laramie at New Hampshire Fish and Game, to work on removing deer from Long Island in Winnipesaukee. And Winnipesaukee is a lake that's 21 miles long. Long Island happens to be one of the larger islands in Lake Winnipesaukee. It's about 1.5 miles long by a half a mile wide. And in the 60s into the early 70s, there was an annual deer hunt there with veterans or disabled folks, mostly disabled veterans. In fact, a good friend of mine for much of my life, Bill Bushy, regaled me with stories about the Long Island deer hunts that he was on. He was a disabled Korean War veteran in a wheelchair and had great stories about hunting deer on Long Island. Well, that hunt stopped in the early to mid-70s, and the deer population, because of that, grew significantly. In fact, by 2 different times, Fish and Game had conducted surveys of the island and counted over 100 deer. So that's 100 deer in a little over a square mile, compared to the rest of the state where the deer population was more like 5 or 10 per square mile. So a significant overpopulated population. And rather than start the hunt again, the politics involved, I guess, led to the fact that Fish and Game was asked to remove deer from Long Island in 1983. So Henry and I went up in early November. I think it was like November 4th, and by this time we had caught maybe a dozen deer or so. We had used these big Havahart type traps called clover traps that you could catch deer in. We had built some corrals and caught a few deer that way, but by now we were using our tranquilizer guns with a dart that's about 3 or 4 inches long, and we were able to get some radios to attach to the back of the dart so that when you fired the dart into an animal and the animal went down, you could track that animal in the dark. So this particular night, for some reason, Henry Laramie had loaned his tranquilizer gun to the local CO Pete Lyons, who was the district chief in that area, and Chuck Kenny, the local conservation officer or CO. Well, let me tell you, I learned my lesson there. Never, ever, ever loan a tranquilizer gun to a CO when there were big deer around. Of course, Henry and I had been capturing female deer does only because those are the ones that would produce more fawns, so we wanted to reduce the number of does on the island. So Pete and Chuck headed off, and Henry and I were headed somewhere else, and I got a radio call from Pete. He said, well, you know, we've darted a deer, we want you to come find it. And that was my specialty. I could go in the blackness of the night. Now these deer that we were tranquilizing, the best drug that we had and still is in use, if you shine a light on the animal or make a loud noise, especially any sharp noise, the animal will get up and run off. Deer, and later I did moose, same thing. So you have to go up and actually put your hands on these animals in the total darkness and tie them up and make sure you don't step on a stick. So I drove over to the other side of the island, and I met Chuck and Pete, and they said, well, the deer is up there on the hillside. And so I headed up with my radio telemetry, working my way very quietly without my headlight on up the hill, and I got up quite a ways, and then the deer seemed to be off to the left. So I swung over that way, and by then I could tell from the signal that I was getting very close. So when that happens, I literally get on my hands and knees, and I just creep a little bit at a time, making sure that I'm not stepping or kneeling on a branch that would make a noise. So I got over to the deer, and it was a him. Oh yeah. So I had kept I learned to keep a rope in my pocket where I'd put around the deer's neck and tie it off to a tree so they couldn't get away. So I put a rope around this buck's neck and tried to tie it off while there was no tree close enough. Well, I knew that Henry and Chuck and Pete were just down the hill 100 yards from me or less. So I decided, well, I'll just sit on this deer and hold them down until they get here. So I turned my light on and flashed it down the hill, and up the hill they came. And as they got rather close, I'm pretty sure it was Chuck, stepped on a twig. Well, the deer reacted in lightning speed, and within a half a second, I can tell you, I was headed down that hill, steep hill, through the woods, past some big boulders, with my light flashing before my very eyes, hanging on for dear life, that's D-E-E-R life, as this deer bounded down the hill. Suddenly he stopped, but I didn't. I went right over his head onto the ground, and I remember flipping the deer down, but he got back up, and I tried again, and I yelled out, "Come down, take his legs out, take his legs out." Well, by then I was laying kind of back on this hill, and the deer had decided that he wanted to turn me into a soprano. He was trying his best to get me, and I didn't want to let him go so he could back up and get a full charge, so I just held on to him. I yelled, "Chuck, Chuck," as he approached, "take out his back leg." So Chuck went around behind the deer and went to grab a leg, and the deer kicked him under the chin, and down the hill he went. And by then Henry and Pete had arrived, and we bowled the deer over, and were able to tie him up. Now what we did is we sawed his antlers off, because at the time the deer hunting season was still open in New Hampshire, but it was for antlerless deer only, for does only. So it was for bucks only. So we wanted to saw the antlers off this buck to make him illegal to hunt, because when you tranquilize an animal, you're not supposed to consume them for a month or more later. So we sawed the antlers off that buck. We tried to weigh him. We had a scale that went to 200 pounds. He bottomed that out. And if my memory serves me correct, I think he was released in Henniker. So, but this is the buck that took me for a midnight ride on Long Island, Winnipesaukee, New Hampshire. A ride that I'll soon never forget. An awesome ride.